After my husband's death, I sent $500 monthly for 10 years to pay off his debt. But one day, the bank called me. "Ma'am, your husband never had any debts." When I checked, "Good day, dear listeners. It's Louisa again. I'm glad you're here with me. Please like this video and listen to my story till the end and let me know which city you're listening from. That way I can see how far my story has traveled. My name is Dorothy Ellison, and I was 68 years old when I finally learned the truth. But to understand what happened, you have to go back. All the way back to when life was still whole. Robert and I had been married for 41 years. We met at a church picnic in Dayton, Ohio, in the summer of 1971. He was holding a paper plate with potato salad and squinting at the sun, and I thought he looked like the most honest man I had ever seen. I was right about that. Robert Ellison was the kind of man who returned extra change to cashiers, who remembered the names of nurses and janitors, who never once in 4 decades raised his voice at me. We raised 2 sons, Daniel and Edward, in a yellow house on Crescent Lane, and when the boys grew up and moved away, Robert and I filled the quiet with evening walks, Friday dinners at Carmela's Italian Kitchen, and a garden that was always slightly overgrown because neither of us had the heart to pull things out by the roots. We were not wealthy. Robert worked as a mid-level accountant for a manufacturing firm for 30 years. I taught 3rd grade for 22. We had a modest savings account, a paid-off mortgage, and no debt. Robert was meticulous about that. "We don't owe anyone anything, Dot," he used to say. "That's the only real freedom there is." He died on a Tuesday in March. A heart attack, sudden and without warning, in the parking lot of a grocery store. He was 67 years old. He had gone to buy orange juice. I will not dwell on the grief. You either know what that kind of loss feels like, or you don't, and no words I choose will bridge that distance. What I will tell you is that the weeks after Robert's death were a blur of casseroles brought by neighbors, paperwork I didn't understand, and the particular silence of a house where someone used to be. It was 6 weeks after the funeral when the first call came. I was sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of tea that had gone cold, sorting through a stack of Robert's files, insurance documents, tax returns, old receipts he never threw away. The phone rang. A man's voice, measured and professional. "Is this Dorothy Ellison?" "Yes," I said. "Mrs. Ellison, my name is Gerald Marsh. I'm calling from Pinnacle Credit Recovery on behalf of First Federal Lending. I'm sorry to contact you at this time, but I'm reaching out regarding an outstanding balance on an account held by your late husband, Robert Ellison." I felt something cold move through me. Robert didn't have any debts. "I understand this may come as a surprise," the man said, his voice softening in a practiced way. "Sometimes accounts of this nature aren't discussed within the household. The outstanding balance is $85,000. Under Ohio law, as the surviving spouse, you may have liability for certain marital debts. However, we are prepared to work with you on a payment arrangement." $85,000. I set down my cold tea very carefully. "I'll need to see documentation," I said. "Of course. I'll mail a summary packet to your address. In the meantime, I want you to know we're not looking to make this harder than it needs to be. A payment of $500 per month would keep the account in good standing while we process the estate review." The packet arrived 4 days later. It looked official. Letterhead, account numbers, a blurry photocopy of what appeared to be a loan agreement with Robert's signature at the bottom. I was not a lawyer. I was a recently widowed 3rd grade teacher who had just buried her husband of 41 years. I looked at that signature, and I felt the specific helplessness of someone who has no one left to ask. I called Daniel, my older son. He lived in Phoenix, was busy with his own family, and listened to me read portions of the letter with the distracted attention of a man watching 2 things at once. "Mom, if it says his name on it, you probably have to deal with it. Maybe just pay it for now and sort it out later. Later. That word cost me $60,000. I set up the automatic transfer the following Monday. $500 every month to a routing number printed on an official-looking payment slip. It felt responsible. It felt like the right thing to do. Robert would have hated to leave behind a debt, I told myself. This was the last thing I could do for him. What I didn't know, what I had no reason to suspect, was that the signature on that document was a forgery. That Robert had never borrowed a single dollar from any institution called First Federal Lending. That the voice of Gerald Marsh belonged to a man named Craig Holloway. And that Craig Holloway was married to my stepdaughter, Linda. For 10 years, I paid. Every first Monday of the month, $500 left my checking account and disappeared into what I believed was the weight of Robert's unfinished business. I marked it in my ledger under a column I labeled simply R's account. It became as routine as the electric bill, as unquestioned as the property tax. I told no one about it. Not Daniel, not Edward, not my neighbor Patrice, who knew everything else about my life. It felt private. It felt like grief made practical. In those 10 years, life continued in the way life does. I retired fully from substitute teaching at 70. Edward got married to a woman named Claire, and they had a daughter they named Rose, who became the great light of my later years. Daniel divorced and remarried and moved to Seattle. I sold the house on Crescent Lane. It was too large, too full of echoes, and moved into a tidy 2-bedroom apartment in Columbus, close enough to Edward and Claire that I could walk to their house in 12 minutes. I planted tomatoes in pots on the balcony. I joined a book club. I learned slowly and imperfectly how to be one person instead of half of two. And every first Monday, $500. The call came on an ordinary Wednesday in September. I was deadheading my tomato plants when the phone rang. The woman on the line identified herself as Karen Price, a customer service representative at Ohio Statewide Bank, where Robert and I had held our joint account for 23 years. "Mrs. Ellison," she said, "I'm calling as part of our deceased account holder outreach. We periodically review dormant accounts, and I wanted to confirm that you're aware of a small savings account in your late husband's name that was never formally closed." "I wasn't aware," I said. "No problem at all. I can help you with that process. I also want to take this opportunity to let you know, and please don't be alarmed, this is just standard review. Our records show that Mr. Robert Ellison had no outstanding loans or debt products with any affiliated institution at the time of his death. His credit file was completely clean." I stood very still on my balcony. One of my tomato plants needed water. I noticed this in a distant, automatic way. "Could you repeat that?" I said. "Of course. Our records and the credit bureau report we pull as part of estate reviews show that your husband carried 0 debt at time of death. No mortgages, no personal loans, no lines of credit." After I hung up, I sat down in my patio chair and did not move for a long time. Then I went inside and found my old ledgers. I had kept every one of them. 7 composition notebooks, the kind with the black and white speckled covers, lined and dated in my 3rd grade teacher handwriting. I opened the first one and found the first entry. March, 14 years ago. No, 10 years of payments. I counted forward. 10 years, 12 months per year, $500 per month, $60,000. I had given $60,000 to someone, and according to Ohio Statewide Bank, it had nothing to do with any debt Robert ever owed. I want to describe what I felt in that moment, but the honest answer is that I felt several things at once, and they did not fit neatly together. There was the sharp physical sensation of having been struck, a kind of retroactive blow to the chest. There was humiliation, hot and immediate, the particular shame of realizing you have been fooled for a very long time by people who counted on you not to look closely. And underneath both of those, quieter and more dangerous, was something that took me a moment to name. It was anger, not the flaring, tearful kind, the slow kind, the kind that doesn't burn itself out. I thought about the voice of Gerald Marsh. I thought about how it had found me 6 weeks after I buried my husband, when I was barely sleeping and couldn't finish a meal. I thought about the packet that had looked so official, with Robert's signature, that I had never once thought to question, because why would anyone forge a dead man's signature for a widow who taught 3rd grade? And then I thought about Linda Holloway, née Ellison, Robert's daughter from his first marriage. We had never been close. There was a brittle politeness between us that both of us maintained for Robert's sake, and after Robert died, it had frayed into something I could only describe as mutual avoidance. She had come to the funeral with her husband, Craig, and left before the reception. She had called twice in the following year and then not again. I had not found this unusual. Some family relationships simply don't survive the person who anchored them, but Craig Holloway had a background in financial services. I remembered Robert mentioning it once, vaguely, years ago. Collections or lending or something of that nature. I sat at my kitchen table with my 7 ledgers in front of me and I thought, is it possible? And then, more quietly, of course it is. I did not cry. I made a list instead. That is what I do when I am frightened and furious and have no one in the room to turn to. I make a list. At the top of the page, I wrote, what I know, what I need to prove, what I need to do. By the time I went to bed that night, I had the beginning of a plan. The next morning, I called Ohio Statewide Bank before the branch even opened and left a message asking to speak with Karen Price directly. When she called me back at 9:15, I was ready. I asked her to walk me through everything available on Robert's credit history. She was cautious at first. Privacy protocols, she said, estate procedures. But when I explained calmly that I had been making payments for 10 years on a debt that, according to her own records, did not exist, her tone shifted. She put me on hold twice. When she came back the second time, she gave me the name of the bank's fraud liaison officer and told me to come in as soon as I could. I drove to the branch that afternoon with my 7 ledgers in a canvas bag. The fraud liaison officer was a man named Thomas Adler, mid-40s, with the careful manner of someone trained to deliver bad news without escalating it. He reviewed the payment records I had brought. He looked at the routing number printed on the payment slip from the original packet. He typed something into his computer. Then he looked at me over his glasses. "Mrs. Ellison," he said, "this routing number belongs to a private account, not a lending institution." "Whose private account?" I asked. "I can't tell you that directly. That would require a subpoena. But I can tell you that it is not associated with any entity called First Federal Lending. That company, as far as I can determine, does not exist." I had suspected this. Hearing it confirmed still felt like stepping off a curb you didn't see. Thomas Adler gave me the direct number for the Columbus field office of the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit and strongly recommended I contact them. He also recommended a consumer fraud attorney. He wrote down a name, Susan Park, who specialized in elder financial abuse cases. I thanked him, picked up my canvas bag, and walked out to my car. I sat in the parking lot for 10 minutes. Then I called Susan Park's office from my cell phone and made an appointment for the following Tuesday. Susan Park was 51, efficient, and possessed of the specific quality I needed most at that moment, which was the ability to make me feel that being deceived was not the same thing as being stupid. We sat in her office for 90 minutes. I showed her the ledgers, the original packet, the payment slip, the death certificate, and the notes I had taken after Karen Price's call. She read everything carefully. "The signature on this loan document," she said, tapping the photocopy from the original packet, "can be analyzed by a handwriting forensics specialist. If it's a forgery, that's one pillar. The routing number is a second. The non-existence of the lending company is a third. She looked at me steadily. Do you have a name in mind for who might have done this? I told her about Craig Holloway. I told her about his background in financial services, about Linda, about the timing. 6 weeks after Robert's death, before I had fully processed anything. Susan made notes without reacting. I want to be clear, she said, that having a suspicion and having proof are two different things, and we proceed only on proof. But what you've brought me today is enough to begin. She filed a preliminary fraud report with the Columbus Police Department that week and initiated contact with the FBI liaison Thomas Adler had recommended. She also sent the original payment packet to a document examiner named Dr. Patricia Osei at Ohio State University, who specialized in questioned documents. Dr. Osei's report came back 11 days later. I was at Susan's office when she read it aloud to me. The signature on the loan document was a tracing, a careful one, done with a light source beneath the paper, most likely, but a tracing nonetheless. The pen pressure was inconsistent with a naturally written signature. The letter formations didn't match the 7 exemplars Susan had obtained from Robert's actual bank documents. It was not Robert's signature. Someone had taken something Robert had signed. A check, a form, something ordinary, and traced his name onto a fraudulent loan document. Then they had waited for him to die. I don't know how to describe what it felt like to hear that. It wasn't surprise. By then, I had moved past surprise. It was something more like grief reopened, a new injury in a place that had only just begun to scar over. Someone had used my husband's hand against me, had turned the most ordinary thing, his signature, the way he looped the R, the long tail on his final N, into a weapon. I pressed my hands flat on the table and breathed slowly. Meanwhile, I didn't know it yet, but 200 miles away in Cincinnati, Linda Holloway had received a call. I learned this later, much later, from documents produced in Discovery. The call had come from a man who had worked at the same collections firm as Craig years ago, who had heard through professional channels that a fraud inquiry had been opened involving a deceased Robert Ellison of Columbus, Ohio. He had called Craig as a courtesy. Craig had hung up and walked into the kitchen where Linda was making coffee and said, simply, "Dorothy is asking questions." Susan filed the formal civil complaint on a Friday. By Monday, Craig Holloway had hired a lawyer. I found this out because Susan called me that evening to tell me that she had received a letter from an attorney named Douglas Fenn, representing Craig and Linda Holloway, which characterized my complaint as a baseless and defamatory action brought by a grieving widow who has confused a legitimate debt collection matter with criminal conduct. The letter requested that I withdraw the complaint or face a countersuit for defamation. I remember sitting with the phone pressed to my ear and feeling, for just a moment, very tired. "What does this mean?" I asked Susan. "It means they're scared," she said. "People who have nothing to hide don't hire attorneys the day a complaint is filed. We hold our course." But holding our course became harder 2 days later when Linda called me herself. I hadn't spoken to her in nearly 3 years. Her voice was the same. Smooth, with the slightly theatrical warmth she had always used with me, a warmth that Robert had found reassuring and that I had always found faintly hollow. "Dorothy," she said, "I think there's been a terrible misunderstanding, and I want to clear it up before this goes any further. My father had a private loan, something he was embarrassed about, something he didn't want to burden you with. Craig was trying to help you settle it quietly. He should have explained things better. I understand that, and I'm sorry if the communication was confusing. But Dorothy, what you're doing, accusing us of fraud, it's going to tear this family apart." "We are not a family, Linda," I said. There was a pause. When she spoke again, the warmth was gone. "Dorothy, you are 78 years old. This process, the lawyers, the courts, the stress of it, it's not good for someone your age. And I want you to think very carefully about what happens if you continue. We have documentation too. We have records of Craig's work on this account that will make your complaint look vindictive. You'll spend your savings on legal fees and end up with nothing. I recognized what this was. I had taught children for 22 years, and I knew what it looked like when someone tried to make you feel small so they could walk past you. She was not warning me. She was threatening me and dressing it in concern. "I'll pass your comments along to my attorney," I said, and I ended the call. I sat for a long time after that. My hands were shaking slightly. Not from fear, I realized, but from the effort of keeping my voice level. Because part of what Linda had said was true. I was 78 years old. The process would be stressful and long, and there was no guarantee of the outcome. I had already lost $60,000. Was I prepared to spend more, in time, in energy, in the quiet peace I had built for myself, to see this through? I thought about Robert, about the way he used to say we don't owe anyone anything, about the fact that someone had taken his handwriting and made it into a lie. Yes, I decided, I was prepared. The following week, Craig escalated. He sent a letter, through his attorney, formally, alleging that I had made defamatory statements to officers at Ohio Statewide Bank and to Susan Park and to the Columbus Police, damaging his professional reputation. He demanded a retraction and $30,000 in damages. I brought the letter to Susan. She read it twice, set it down, and said, "He's bluffing. This is a pressure tactic. His claim has no basis because the statements you made were truthful, made in the context of a legitimate legal process, and protected. We respond formally, deny everything, and continue." She was calm. I tried to borrow her calm. The FBI opened a formal inquiry in the second week of October. A special agent named Marcus Webb called me and asked me to come in for an interview. I went with Susan. I brought my ledgers. I answered every question Agent Webb asked me, clearly and without embellishment. When I left his office, I felt the specific relief of having handed something very heavy to someone stronger. 3 days later, after a week during which I had slept poorly and eaten less than I should, I called Edward. I told him I needed to come stay with him and Claire and Rose for a few days. "Of course, Mom," he said without hesitation. I packed a bag, drove to his house on Fieldstone Drive, and spent 4 days doing nothing more demanding than reading to Rose, eating Claire's cooking, and sitting in the backyard in the late October sun. I did not look at my phone more than twice a day. I let the legal machinery run without me for a while. On the morning of the 5th day, I woke up early, made coffee, and sat at Edward's kitchen table feeling something I hadn't felt in weeks. Ready. The offer came through Douglas Fenn's office on a Tuesday, 10 days after I returned from Edward's house. Susan forwarded me the email with a single line of her own. "Read this and call me." The letter from Fenn was 4 paragraphs of careful legal language that resolved, when stripped of its formality, to the following. Craig and Linda Holloway, without admitting any wrongdoing, were prepared to offer Dorothy Ellison a settlement of $25,000 in exchange for a full withdrawal of the civil complaint and a signed agreement not to cooperate with any ongoing law enforcement inquiry. $25,000, less than half of what I had lost. And in exchange, I would be required to go silent. When I called Susan, she walked me through the legal implications in her patient, methodical way. I could accept the settlement. The money would be real and immediate. The FBI inquiry was still in early stages and carried no guarantee. Litigation, if we pursued it, could take 2 to 3 years and cost significant attorney fees, though she was working on contingency. "I want you to understand both paths clearly," she said. "This is your decision. Do you think they would offer $25,000 if they didn't think they were going to lose? I asked. There was a brief pause. No, she said. I don't. Then we decline. I had known my answer before I called her, but I wanted to hear her reasoning confirm it. What I noticed in the days that followed was that something had shifted in me. The fear that had run underneath everything since September, a low, persistent hum like a refrigerator in a quiet room, had quieted. In its place was something steadier. Not confidence exactly, more like alignment. The sense that what I was doing and what I believed were pointing in the same direction, and that this mattered more than comfort. I had lived a long time. I had watched people choose the easier path to preserve their peace, and I had seen what that peace cost them. A woman in my book club had once told me about a dispute with a contractor who had stolen from her $5,000, fraudulent work, and how she had eventually let it go because the process of fighting it was too exhausting. I just wanted it over, she had said. I wanted to feel normal again. I understood that. But I also understood that the feeling of normal she had gotten afterward had a floor missing from it, a place you couldn't step without dropping through. I was not willing to live on that floor. I called Marguerite Foster that week. Marguerite was my oldest friend. We had met during my first year of teaching, when she was a fourth-grade teacher across the hall, and in 50 years of friendship, she had attended my wedding, held my hand at Robert's funeral, and helped me move into my apartment in Columbus with the efficiency and humor of someone who takes on other people's hard things without being asked. She was 81 and had a titanium hip and an opinion on everything. I told her the whole story over the phone. All of it. The 10 years of payments, the bank call, Susan Park, the FBI, Linda's phone call, the settlement offer. I had not told her before because I had been ashamed, and I was only now recognizing how much that shame had cost me in isolation. When I finished, Marguerite was quiet for a moment. Dorothy Ellison, she said. You have been carrying this alone for months, you foolish woman. I know. And you said no to the settlement? Yes. Good. I could hear her settle into her chair. Now, what do you need? What I needed, I discovered, was to say it all out loud to someone who would not panic, would not try to talk me out of it, and would not treat me as if age had made me fragile. Marguerite did none of those things. She asked careful questions. She told me she thought I was right, and then she said something that stayed with me. The reason people like Linda and Craig operate the way they do, she said, is because they count on their victims being too tired, too old, or too frightened to fight back. They chose you because they thought you were all three. Show them you're none of them. I told Edward that same week. His reaction was different. There was the immediate alarm of a son, the instinct to take over, to call people, to fix it himself. I let him feel that for a moment, and then I asked him gently to trust that I had the right people in place, and that what I needed from him was not intervention, but steadiness. He took a breath. Okay, Mom, he said, but I want to know everything, and I want to be there. Whatever that looks like, I'll be there. I took his hand across the kitchen table, the same table where I had spent 4 days recovering, and I felt the specific gratitude of someone who has asked for exactly what she needed and received it. Marguerite drove up from Dayton the following weekend, and we spent Saturday afternoon going over my ledgers together, cross-referencing dates and organizing the documents into a system that Susan's paralegal later told me was one of the clearest client files she had ever seen. You taught 3rd grade, Marguerite said, labeling a folder. Organization is survival. I laughed properly for the first time in months. Meanwhile, in Cincinnati, Craig and Linda waited for my answer to arrive through their attorney's office. When it came, a formal declination of the settlement offer, signed by Susan Park. I was told later that Craig had put his fist through a cabinet door. I would not know that for a long time. But somehow, even without knowing it, I felt the weight of it shift. They came on a Saturday in November without warning. I was in my kitchen, brewing coffee and listening to the radio, when the buzzer for my apartment building sounded. I pressed the intercom button. Yes? Dorothy, it's Linda. And Craig. We're downstairs. Can we come up, please? We just want to talk. I stood very still for a moment. My first instinct was to say no. My second instinct, the more careful one, was to recognize that whatever they were about to say, it would be better for me to hear it, and, if possible, to record it, than to turn them away and wonder. I pressed the entry button and went to unlock my apartment door. Then I picked up my phone and opened the voice recorder app. I set it face down on the kitchen counter, confirmed it was running, and walked to the door. They looked, when I opened it, like people who had rehearsed their faces. Linda was wearing a soft gray cardigan and had her hair down, which she rarely did. It was a visual choice. I understood immediately, meant to make her look less formal, more approachable, less like an adversary. Craig was in a fleece vest, hands in pockets, and wore an expression of practiced regret. "Thank you for letting us in," Linda said. I stepped back to let them enter and did not say anything warm. We sat in my living room, they on the sofa, I in the armchair across from them, with the kitchen and its running recorder behind me through the open doorway. I folded my hands in my lap and waited. Linda began. She spoke about family, about how Robert would have hated this, how conflict like this would have broken his heart. She said she had lost sleep over it. She said that she and Craig had made mistakes in how they handled the account, but that their intentions had been to protect me from the distress of managing it myself, and that they understood how it could have looked, and they were sorry for that. It was, I will admit, a competent performance. If I had heard it 6 months earlier, before Thomas Adler, before Susan Park, before Dr. Osei's handwriting report, it might have worked. The language of family, the appeal to Robert's memory, the reframing of fraud as clumsy kindness. But I had held Dr. Osei's report in my hands. I knew what a traced signature looked like in technical language. I knew that first federal lending did not exist. I knew that $60,000 had flowed for 10 years into a private account. So I listened, and I said nothing, and I watched them. Craig spoke next. His tone was different. Less performative warmth, more measured gravity. He said that they had consulted with their attorney and believed they had a strong legal position. He said that the process I had set in motion would be embarrassing and painful for everyone, including Edward, including Daniel, including, and here he paused, including me, when certain aspects of Robert's financial history became public record. "What aspects?" I asked. It was the first thing I had said since they sat down. Craig met my eyes. "Robert wasn't perfect, Dorothy. No one is. There are things in his history that you may not have known about. Things that, if they came out in discovery, could change how you see him. We'd hate for that to happen." There it was. Under the cardigan and the fleece vest and the language of regret. A threat to Robert's memory. An implication that they had ammunition that could reframe my dead husband as a man with secrets, and that they would use it if I made them. I looked at Craig for a long moment. Robert Ellison was examined by a bank fraud unit, an FBI financial crimes specialist, a forensic document examiner, and his own complete credit history, I said. He was exactly who I knew he was. You have nothing. Craig's expression didn't break immediately, but something behind it shifted. A micro-adjustment, like a door closing in a face that had been used to doors opening. Linda leaned forward. "Dorothy, please. We're trying to give you a way out of this that doesn't destroy the family. We're trying to be kind." "You stopped being kind 10 years ago," I said, when you called me 6 weeks after my husband's funeral and told me he owed you $85,000. The silence was long. Linda stood up first. The softness had gone out of her face entirely. "We came here in good faith," she said. "No," I said. "You came here because your attorney told you that the FBI inquiry is moving forward, and your settlement offer was declined, and you needed another option. This is not good faith. This is a last attempt." Craig stood. He was a large man, and I noticed, clinically, that he used his height as he rose. A physical punctuation. "You're making a mistake," he said. "Then I'll make it," I said. I stood and walked to my apartment door and opened it. For just a moment, Linda's face did something complicated. Not remorse exactly, but the expression of someone who has miscalculated and knows it and cannot recalibrate in time. Then they left. I closed the door, leaned my back against it. My heart was beating hard. I will not pretend it wasn't. There is a particular fear that comes from having a large, angry man tell you you're making a mistake in your own home. It is the kind of fear that reminds you of your body's smallness, but underneath the fear was something else. Because they had come here. They had left Cincinnati and driven to Columbus and stood in my living room and tried every tool they had. And none of it had worked. And I had a recording of all of it. I went to the kitchen, picked up my phone, stopped the recorder, and called Susan. The civil trial was scheduled for a Thursday in late February, 14 months after Karen Price's phone call had started everything. I want to tell you about the drive to the courthouse. Edward drove. He had insisted on this, and I let him. It was a cold morning, the kind of Ohio winter morning where the sky is a uniform pale gray and the bare trees look like they've been drawn in pencil. I sat in the passenger seat with my hands in my coat pockets and watched the city go by. I thought about Robert. I thought about a specific evening about 3 years before he died, when we had sat on the back porch of the house on Crescent Lane with glasses of sweet tea, not talking particularly, just watching the yard get dark. I had been happy without noting it, the way you sometimes are. I thought, I am doing this for that evening, for everything that was true. Edward parked the car, and we walked to the entrance together. He held the door. Neither of us spoke. There are moments in life that are too large for conversation, and that was one of them. I remember the sound of my own footsteps on the marble floor of the lobby echoing back at me and thinking that I had waited 14 months for this day and that it had still somehow arrived faster than I expected. The courtroom was smaller than I had expected. Courtrooms on television are always large and theatrical. This one had the particular smell of institutional carpeting and fluorescent lighting, and the gallery was half full. A few journalists, a representative from the FBI field office, Edward and Claire in the second row, and Marguerite, who had driven up from Dayton again, sitting with her titanium hip and her good wool coat and her expression of focused attention, as though she were about to listen to a very important lecture. Susan and I sat at the plaintiff's table. Craig and Linda sat across from us with Douglas Fenn, their attorney. I did not look at them when I came in. I didn't need to. The case Susan had built was, by the time we reached trial, composed of 6 independent pillars. The forensic document examiner's report on the signature. The FBI's financial trace on the routing number, which led, through 2 shell accounts, to a personal account in Craig Holloway's name. The non-existence of First Federal Lending as any registered entity in the state of Ohio. Phone records showing that a call to my home number had been placed from a cell phone registered to Craig Holloway 6 weeks after Robert's death. A deposition from Craig's former colleague at the collections firm who testified that Craig had discussed the scheme with him in 2014, describing it as collecting on a family debt. And the recording from my living room in November, in which Craig had implied that he possessed damaging information about Robert. Information that, on examination, did not exist. Each piece alone might have been questioned. Together, they were not a mosaic. They were a wall. Douglas Fenn attempted, in his opening statement, to frame the case as a misunderstanding, an informal family agreement, poorly documented, that had been misconstrued by a grieving widow. He used the word informal 11 times. I counted. Craig testified first. He was composed in the beginning, measured, using the language of financial services he knew well, referencing documents and dates and procedural language. He acknowledged that First Federal Lending was an informal operating name for a private arrangement. He said that Robert had asked him personally to manage a debt. He said the payments were exactly as agreed. Susan's cross-examination was not aggressive. It was something more effective than aggression. It was precise. "Mr. Holloway," she said, "you've testified that Robert Ellison personally asked you to manage this debt. Can you tell the court when this conversation occurred?" I believe it was 2010. "You believe?" 2010, yes. "Were there any other witnesses to this conversation?" "It was a private conversation." "Was it conducted in person, by phone, by email?" A pause. "In person." "Where?" Another pause, slightly longer. "At a family gathering." "Which family gathering? Was this Thanksgiving, a birthday, a wedding?" Craig shifted in his seat. "I don't recall the specific occasion." "You don't recall the specific occasion of the conversation in which your father-in-law asked you to personally manage an $85,000 debt on his behalf?" It was not a question. Susan let it sit in the air. She continued. She walked him through the routing number, asked him to explain, account by account, the path the money had traveled. She asked him about the signature on the loan document. She asked him to explain why Robert Ellison's complete credit file, obtained from all 3 major bureaus, showed no record of any loan from any source that corresponded to the debt he was claiming. Each answer Craig gave required the next question, and the next question was always the one he had no good answer for. He began to qualify. He began to say he would have to check his records. He began in the particular way of someone who has built an architecture of lies and is watching it develop cracks, to contradict himself. I watched his hands. They were flat on the table at first, the way a man places them when he wants to project steadiness. By the end of Susan's cross-examination, they were no longer flat. He had curled his fingers slightly, as though gripping something invisible. A small thing. But I noticed it. Linda was worse. She had told her attorney that Robert had mentioned the debt to her personally. Under Susan's cross-examination, the timeline she gave made it impossible for this conversation to have occurred when she claimed Robert had been hospitalized during that period for a knee procedure and had not been at any family gathering. His medical records confirmed this. When Susan pointed this out, Linda's composure cracked in a way that was visible from across the room, a tightening around the eyes, a breath taken too quickly. "Is it possible you're misremembering the date?" Susan asked. It may have been a different time. I'm not certain of the exact." "Mrs. Holloway, you testified under oath that this conversation occurred in June of 2011. Robert Ellison's medical records show he was hospitalized from June 3rd through June 19th of that year. Was the conversation before June 3rd or after June 19th? Linda looked at Douglas Fenn. He could not help her. "I'm not sure," she said. The courtroom was very quiet. I looked at the jury at that moment. Something Susan had told me not to do too often, because it could read as anxious. But I looked then. 12 ordinary Ohio people, a retired postal worker in the front row, a young woman in a blue blazer taking careful notes, a man who reminded me, in the set of his shoulders, of Robert's old colleague from work. They were watching Linda with the particular attention of people who have just heard something confirm what they already suspected. Not satisfaction. Judgment. Careful, earned, and final. I sat at the plaintiff's table with my hands folded in front of me, and I felt, not triumph, exactly. Something quieter. The feeling of a long correction finally completing itself. The jury deliberated for 4 hours. I spent those 4 hours in a small waiting room down the hall from the courtroom with Edward and Claire and Marguerite. Claire had brought a thermos of coffee and sandwiches in a paper bag, which was such a practical and loving thing to do that I almost wept over it. Edward sat close to me, not talking much, in the way he has always had. A kind of physical presence, a willingness to simply occupy the same space. Marguerite read a novel. She said it helped her not to watch the clock. I did watch the clock. I won't pretend I didn't. The minutes moved the way minutes do when you are waiting for something irreversible, unevenly, with strange compressions and expansions. At one point, 30 minutes had passed, and it felt like 10. At another point, I looked up and only 4 minutes had moved. I drank 2 cups of Claire's coffee and ate half a sandwich without tasting it, and I thought about the jury, about what they were doing in that room right now, whether they were convinced, whether the 6 pillars Susan had built were holding in their minds the way they had held in mine. I thought, what if they're not enough? And then I thought of Craig's hands curling on the table, of Linda saying, I'm not sure, to a question that anyone telling the truth could have answered in a second. And I let the doubt pass. At 2:47 in the afternoon, the bailiff came to tell us the jury had reached a verdict. We filed back into the courtroom. Craig and Linda were already seated at the defense table. Craig was looking at the surface of the table. Linda was looking at nothing in particular, her face a careful blank. I looked at them both for a moment. These 2 people who had called me 6 weeks after my husband's death and spent 10 years taking my money and a year of my time and untold quantities of my peace. And then I looked away and took my seat next to Susan. The judge read the verdict. On the civil claim of fraud, found for the plaintiff. On the claim of intentional infliction of emotional distress, found for the plaintiff. On the question of damages, the jury awarded me $60,000 in compensatory damages, the full amount I had lost, plus $45,000 in punitive damages, reflecting the deliberate and sustained nature of the fraud. $105,000. I heard the number, and I felt something move through me that I cannot fully name. It was not purely happiness, and it was not purely relief. It was more like the sensation of something that has been held under pressure finally releasing. 10 years, 120 monthly payments, $60,000 gone into a private account while I believed I was honoring my husband's memory. And now, a jury of 12 people had heard all of it and had said, this was wrong, and the wrong will be answered. I did not cry in the courtroom. I had decided some months before that I would not. Not because I was suppressing anything, but because there was nothing in that moment that required tears. Tears are for loss. What this was restoration. I shook Susan's hand. She gripped mine firmly with both of hers and said quietly, Robert would have been proud of you. I believed her. In the row behind me, I heard Edward exhale. A long, slow release, as though he had been holding his breath for 14 months. Claire put her arm around him. Marguerite, beside them, closed her novel on her thumb and nodded once, as if confirming something she had always known. Across the room, Craig said something to Douglas Fenn in a low voice. Fenn shook his head. Linda was still looking at the middle distance. I watched her for just a moment, long enough to see the moment when the blank expression broke, not into tears, but into something harder and smaller, a clenching of the jaw, a downward cast of the eyes. It was the face of someone who had placed a very large bet and watched it lose. I felt no satisfaction in it. I looked away. What happened to Craig and Linda after the civil verdict moved quickly. The FBI's parallel criminal investigation had been running alongside the civil case, and Marcus Webb had told Susan in October that they were near ready to move. 3 weeks after the civil verdict, a federal grand jury indicted Craig Holloway on 2 counts of wire fraud, 1 count of identity theft for the use of Robert's signature without consent, and 1 count of conspiracy. Linda was indicted on 1 count of conspiracy and 1 count of wire fraud as a co-conspirator, based on evidence, including her appearance in the recording from my apartment, that she had been fully aware of and complicit in the scheme. Douglas Fenn withdrew as their attorney 2 days after the indictments. He cited a conflict of interest. I suspected he simply did not want to lose twice. Craig entered a guilty plea 5 months later, after what Susan described as a negotiated agreement that still resulted in 32 months of federal prison time and full restitution of the civil judgment. Linda, after initially pleading not guilty, changed her plea when it became clear that the recording from my apartment and the testimony from Craig's former colleague were going to be used in full at trial. She received 18 months of federal supervised release and a criminal fraud conviction that would follow her name for the rest of her life. The day the guilty plea was entered, Agent Webb called me personally to let me know. I thanked him. I thanked him for the seriousness with which he had treated the case, for not making me feel, as some people had in the early stages, that an old woman's lost savings were a small thing. He said, "Mrs. Ellison, this was not a small thing." I appreciated that more than he knew. When I hung up, I sat in my kitchen for a little while in the quiet. Then I called Marguerite. She said, "Well, it's about time." Then I called Edward. He cried a little. I didn't stop him. Then I sat alone, and I thought about Robert, about the parking lot, about the orange juice he never got to bring home, about the signature someone had traced in lamplight after he was gone to take from me what they could. And I thought about this. Robert was right. We didn't owe anyone anything. The freedom he meant, financial freedom, the quiet dignity of a life without obligation to people who don't wish you well. It was real. It was worth protecting. They had tried to use his name against me, and in the end, his name was clean. The civil judgment came through to my account 6 weeks later. $105,000 transferred through the court's restitution process. I paid Susan's firm their contingency percentage. I paid my portion of the expert witness fees. And what remained, I put in a savings account at Ohio Statewide Bank, the same bank where Karen Price had called me on an ordinary Wednesday and started everything. And I let it sit there for a month while I decided what to do with it. I already knew, I think, but some decisions deserve to be made slowly. That spring, I took a trip to Ireland. Robert and I had talked about Ireland for years. The West Coast, the cliffs of Moher, the small villages where everything was green in a way that photographs never quite captured. It had been a someday plan, the kind that accrues through decades of intention and never quite becomes an appointment. After he died, I had assumed that someday plan had died with him, that some things belong only to the person you had intended to do them with. But I went. I booked a 2-week tour through a travel company recommended by a woman in my book club, and I flew from Columbus to Dublin on a Tuesday morning in April, and I watched the coast of Ireland come up through the airplane window in the early light, green and gray and entirely real. Standing at the cliffs of Moher on the 3rd day, with the wind coming off the Atlantic and the sea below the color of old pewter, I felt, not that Robert was there, exactly, not anything supernatural, just that the distance I had been carrying since his death was not as total as it had seemed, that I was still capable of being without him in a place that was genuinely beautiful. I bought a postcard at a gift shop in a village called Doolin and wrote on the back, "I made it. You were right about the green. I didn't send it anywhere. I kept it. When I came home, I used a portion of the remaining restitution money to do three things. I fully funded the college account I had started for Rose when she was born. I made a donation to a nonprofit in Columbus that provided legal assistance to elder fraud victims, Susan's recommendation, and one I gave gladly. And I replaced my kitchen table, which had been chipped and wobbling for years, with a new one, solid oak, the kind that would last. I started sleeping well again. Properly, deeply, the way I had not since Robert died. And I recognized only now that part of the sleeplessness of the past decade had been the subterranean anxiety of a woman hemorrhaging money every month who had trained herself not to look at it too directly. When that drain closed, something else opened. My book club read a collection of Marilynne Robinson's essays that fall, and I had things to say about every single one of them. Edward and Claire bought a house with a large backyard, and Rose learned to walk across the grass toward me with the specific determination of a child who has just discovered that legs are for closing distances. She came across that lawn with her arms out, and I met her in the middle. I think that is the truest picture of what my life became. Open in the middle. Enough room to cross toward the people I loved. Now, as for Linda and Craig, I am not a person who takes pleasure in other people's suffering. What had been done to me was wrong, and it was answered, fully, legally, without equivocation. What happened to them afterward was not my doing and not my satisfaction. It was simply consequence. Craig served 26 months in federal prison. The fraud conviction barred him permanently from financial services. He and Linda had sold their house in Cincinnati to cover attorney fees. Linda lost her job when the conviction became public and found doors consistently closed afterward. Their marriage did not survive the prison term intact. What I want to tell you is this: the money was never the point. The point was something that had no dollar figure. It was 41 years of a man who worked carefully, loved his family, left no debts, and deserved to have his name mean exactly what it had always meant. That is what I was protecting. That is what I got back. 10 years is a long time to trust a lie, but it is never too late to trust the truth more. If someone had stolen from you the way they stole from me, what would you do? If this story stayed with you, share it. Leave a comment. And thank you, truly, for listening to the end.